Good afternoon. Welcome to Recovery Services, an overview for special education lead teachers. I am Dr. Jane Strong, Director for the Office of Special Education Procedural Support. Today I will review for you guidance and information about services for students with disabilities. The information contained in this presentation was adapted from the Virginia Department of Education's guidance document entitled Considerations for COVID Recovery Services for Students with Disabilities. That document was released a few weeks ago. A link to the VDOE document is included at the end of this presentation. I will be highlighting for you information that will help you and your teachers at your school with conversations around recovery services. Today's learning objectives are that special education case managers will identify circumstances in which IEP meetings need to be held to consider recovery services, and special education teachers will determine the data sources that are needed for COVID recovery decisions, as well as begin collection and organization of data and analysis of the data. More information about how to put recovery services on an IEP if the team decides they're required will be coming soon in a written guidance document. So what are recovery services? So recovery services are additional temporary service that's required for a student to regain lost skills and fill in gaps where expected progress was not evident. You should consider recovery for any student whose teachers or parents believes the student requires the consideration of recovery. And important to note that not all students with disabilities will require COVID-19 services. As we consider the need for recovery service, we must make individualized decisions about the student's progress in the general education or the aligned curriculum and on the student's IEP goals. Consideration must also be made as to whether the student regressed or is not able to recoup skills at an expected rate. For students who are accessing the SOLs, teachers need to look at the data and determine if the student is progressing in the general curriculum. For students who are accessing the Virginia Alternate Assessment, teachers will need to look at the data related to the aligned standards of learning and whether or not the student is making expected progress. The need for COVID recovery services is not limited to academics only. The threat of COVID-19 long-term effects of social distancing and prolonged disruption of the school routine may create significant stress and impact students' well-being. This is particularly important as a consideration for students with disabilities because they may be more likely to experience challenges in adapting to the many changes brought on by COVID-19 school closure. Professionals working with students with disabilities need to consider the students' social, emotional needs, as well as the impact that the students' well-being may have on their readiness to learn and academic progress. As we continue to talk about recovery services and whether or not they are needed, we will continue to refer to the importance of data. The data and its analysis will be used by IEP teams to determine whether or not a student requires recovery services. We need to remember that prior to determining the need for and the amount of COVID recovery, each IEP team should consider data from a variety of sources. This includes data spanning the continuum of pre-COVID to the return to school. Therefore, IEP teams should use individual student progress data and data about FCPS's offerings to all students during the COVID closure and upon return to school when considering services. We need to remember that not all students will need recovery, and the IEP team will need to determine the amount and type and how it would be scheduled and documented on the IEP. Here are some examples of data points and data sources that teachers and IEP teams will use to consider recovery. Possible data sources are listed, but this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, if a parent suggests that they have data from their experiences at home or from any evaluations from private providers, you need to include and consider that info. As you review the data, keep in mind that you will need to compare the data over time frames. School teams should begin with the data from pre-COVID-19. This will include information from the start of last school year until the closing of schools in March. You'll begin by gathering and reviewing data both informal and formal, from the pre-COVID closure to establish that baseline and compare the skills and performance towards IEP goals and review the progress made on the goals, including how students performed on benchmarks like DRA or iReady or any curriculum benchmark tests, and observations and data from teachers and related services providers as well as parents. Some questions are listed here to help your discussions about the pre-COVID timeframe. Did the student make progress on IEP goals and objectives prior to the ordered school building closure period? What were the student's baseline measures on his or her IEP goals and objectives prior to the ordered school building closure period? And does the IEP team have documentation of the progress the student made during the ordered school closing in the form of progress reports or other information? Once you've gathered the pre-COVID data, now you'll need to consider the COVID-19 school closure data from the spring. While teachers didn't have to collect data for the fourth quarter progress reports or provide grades, teachers should have collected at least progress monitoring on the students' participation during the distance learning. The data examples on this slide, such as student work, observations, and attendance, are similar to the pre-COVID data points, except in addition here you have ESY. So what information do you have from any student summer program or ESY program? It is recognized that there are some students who transition to your school from either a preschool or elementary or middle and then to middle and high programs. This may add a layer of challenges, as you may not be as familiar with the student this year because you did not have the student last year. In these cases, you should reach out to the previous school and teachers and get clarification or analysis of any data that they may have. It's important to take into account the information that the parent shares with you also, and consider all of the information from the distance learning experience. Here are 3 COVID-19 school closure questions to be considered. What goals, accommodations, and services were offered to the student through the temporary learning plan? Next, did the student engage and progress or regress in the educational opportunities that were provided by FCPS? And then next, were special education services and supports offered, and did the student access them? Based on what was offered during the school closure, were these services and supports reasonable in light of the circumstances? Pay particular attention to bullet 2 and 3 as being critical to determine whether the student made progress and why. It's important to consider the educational model that was offered to all students in FCPS last spring, and to consider whether the student took advantage of the continuity of learning during the spring. How was core content instruction and specialized instruction delivered to the student? How was the student's performance during this closure? You want to make sure to report out on student data regarding participation, work completion, grades, and IEP goal progress. As we look at the virtual return to school this fall, school teams are gathering data through the first quarter. The data points may be similar to the pre-COVID and COVID school closure slides we just discussed. However, when you are collecting the data now, you will be considering whether the student requires extensive review to demonstrate previously captured or learned skills. Do they demonstrate any inconsistencies in performance? Do they demonstrate previously mastered or partially required skills presented during the pre-COVID closure? So in other words, are they able to do what they were able to do last year or not? And some students may not be able to, and some students may be commensurate with where you expect, or they may have progressed. As you're looking through this data, remind the teachers and IEP teams to ask themselves these questions. What are the IEP goals? What were they last year? And for this year, how am I keeping data on this year's goals? How am I assessing? Am I seeing gaps? And if yes, where are the gaps? Here are questions to consider as the team is reviewing data around academic needs related to return to school. Is the student attending or participating in the instruction offered? Are there barriers to the student's participation in instruction? An example of a barrier might be an electronics issue, might be an internet issue, it might be that the parent has asked for an adjusted schedule. So all of these things need to be noted. Are the services provided and received consistent with the student's needs? How is the student performing on local assessment data and on classroom tasks as compared to his or her peers? What is the student's rate of learning as you consider the context of the education model and comparing your student with a disability as compared to his or her peers? It is recommended that case managers create a folder of information on each student that includes the answers to these questions as well as summaries of data. Questions to consider as the team reviews this data related to social and emotional and environmental needs appear on this slide. Does the student have any unique social, emotional issues that may impact their learning? Is the student's family and community resilient and supportive? Are there strong family structures available to help the student? And does the family have access to essential resources? The IEP team should consider if the student is accessing instruction currently available. If there are barriers, brainstorm ways to decrease any of the barriers for the student participating and making progress in their IEP. It may be appropriate to revise the IEP and the services if it can be determined that it's not appropriate right now. Students should participate in the meeting depending on age and disability. Reach out to your colleagues in related services, in clinical support, to Office of Special Ed Instruction, both curriculum resource teachers and specialists, any of us in the Office of Special Ed Procedural Support, such as your PSL or Due Process and Eligibility. We're available to assist with looking at the data, with clarifying questions, and helping support you as you go through determining recovery services for your students. Here are some guidelines for case managers to use when considering whether to hold an IEP meeting. It is recommended that schools schedule the meeting after data is collected, so in the 7 to 9 week time frame. So we've had about, I believe, 3 weeks of school. So, you are on your way, hopefully, in gathering data. If you have a parent who is insistent that an IEP team meeting needs to be held, you have the option of going ahead and scheduling the meeting. You could schedule the meeting now with the IEP invitation letter, but explain to the parent that you still need to gather more data and the student needs to participate in more instruction before the meeting is held. You need to look at the student data and any reevaluation if you have it, or any other information on the student's access and progress, and any anticipated need for COVID recovery services. So there could be a reason that you need to go ahead and meet, but you can also discuss with the parent that it is better to make sure that the IEP team meets with the full complement of data available to discuss regression or recoupment. If you need to, though, you do not need to wait the entire 7 to 9 weeks to reconvene. So when is an IEP meeting not needed? If the student is making adequate progress in the general or alternate curriculum, if there's even documentation of some regression from the school closure, but the student seems to be on track to master IEP goals and to recoup lost skills, then you don't need to have a meeting for recovery purpose. If the student did not demonstrate regression from pre-COVID and through the closure to the fall, possibly due to having received an ESY program, then you wouldn't need to schedule a recovery meeting. If the student's regression, recoupment, and progress with new learning this fall is comparable to other students in the curriculum or in the class, then you might not need to have a recovery meeting. Should should you consider and do if a parent makes a request now? Similarly to what was already said, is that you should explain that you need time for instruction and data gathering, but acknowledge the receipt of the parent's request. Make sure that they know you've heard them. Discuss about the need for data and when you would like to hold a meeting. You can go ahead and schedule the meeting now for a few weeks from now, when you can expect to have the data that the IEP team will need. If that is the case, that you're scheduling the meeting a few weeks out, go ahead and open up the IEP to send the invitation now and get it on your calendar. Hold the meeting as soon as is feasible or is possible to hear the parent's request and consider the data you have. If it's appropriate and you refuse to have an IEP meeting altogether because of some of the reasons that we discussed, that there's no need for a meeting, then you would complete a standalone PWN. And we expect to show an example of how a PWN would be written if this is your situation, and we'll put that into the guidance document and in the appendix. As always, reach out to your DPE and OSEPS friends and your PSL if you need assistance with managing parents' expectations for a recovery meeting. Here are important guidelines when determining recovery services. Recovery services should not change the student's least restrictive environment. Now, I will say that again, but also emphasize there may be certain rare circumstances where a student's LRE might change through an IEP. However, recovery services in general is not about the placement or least restrictive environment. Recovery services could be and may be provided over an extended period of time. If additional services are needed, these services could be provided at an alternative schedule or an alternate schedule, after school, before school, during a break, weekends, or next summer. It is important that services not be required to be delivered in only one specific manner. It can be spread out through the course of the year. Recovery services are not a minute-for-minute replacement of services not provided during school closure. And we're going to come back to that concept in the next slide too. Recovery services are data-driven and may not be required for all students. The team will need to agree to the time period required to meet the COVID recovery service proposed, if it is proposed. So as you get more guidance in the future guidance document, and as the next couple weeks happen, we will assist you with how to document the recovery services and documenting it in the IEP. Here on this slide, you see a comparison of COVID-19 recovery and compensatory service. You may have parents who use the word compensatory services in their discussion with you about recovery. They are not synonyms. They're not the same thing. Rather, as the Virginia Department of Education stated, the COVID-19 forced shutdown of schools, gave rise to the need to have a recovery. So services that students might need to get back to where they need to be educationally are considered recovery services. We'll talk about what compensatory services in just a moment. But you see on the left-hand side of your screen, the recovery is an additional service or services offered due to severe regression or lack of progress in the general curriculum as compared to peers, or lack of progress in meeting IEP goals as expected during the IEP year, and is not a minute-for-minute calculation of a makeup service. So compensatory services are a remedy that is a legal remedy under the IDEA when a student has been denied FAPE. If a student has been determined to have been denied a FAPE, the award of compensatory services by FCPS is done sometimes because there may have been an inability for the school to implement the IEP or a failure to implement the IEP. The purpose of a compensatory service is to put the student in the same position he or she would have been if the services hadn't been denied or if FAPE had not been denied. And again, the one overlap between the two programs, compensatory or recovery, is that neither of them are a minute-for-minute situation of makeup services. Here is the link, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, to the VDOE, Virginia Department of Education, document called Considerations for Recovery Services for Students with Disabilities. If you would like to go to that document, you will also get a little more picture about recovery for students without disabilities as well. If you continue to need assistance or you have any questions, please contact the appropriate office listed here. During our partial telework status that we find ourselves in, you may have a quicker response time by using email. We have listed phone numbers here also, though, because at times there are staff in the offices available to the phone. As always, please go to your procedural support liaison, and they generally are best reached through email. And then also don't hesitate to reach out to the Office of Special Ed Instruction when it comes to the instructional information that you've learned, and also an email to them is usually very helpful. So that concludes our presentation today. Thank you for listening, and more information is coming soon in the form of more guidance for how to document recovery services.